Firing line, corporal punishment, S86, take one.
A recent article on the public schools in the big cities listed as the primary problem the problem of discipline. In Detroit, 1,200 guards are employed full-time to maintain order. The public impatience has here and there called for an extension of the use of corporal punishment in the schools, but the National Education Association, in a recent manifesto, vigorously opposed the use of physical punishment on school children, and even suggested it might be unconstitutional, though only 2 states in the Union, Massachusetts and New Jersey, categorically proscribe it. The American Civil Liberties Union has backed several lawsuits which are now climbing their way up the court system, alleging that physical punishment is in violation of due process. Here in England, it is a very old controversy, with the interesting exception that the professional educational organizations are all but united in endorsing the continued use of corporal punishment, notwithstanding that England is the only country in Europe to use the cane, the discontinuation of which was not required for entry into the common market. Mr. Peter Newell, a young educator and journalist and graduate of Cambridge, is an evangelist for abolition and has written a book called A Last Resort, publicizing the widespread use of physical punishment throughout England and celebrating its recent outlawing in the primary schools of central London. The book and the movement have received considerable attention in the New York Times and the Washington Post, though some of it, I suspect, has been jocular. Mr. Charles Kuper is headmaster of the Emmanuel School, a graduate of Oxford who's been a schoolmaster all of his life, except during the 6 years he served in the Royal Navy. Mr. Kuper is an advocate of corporal punishment for reasons he will in due course disclose. But first I should like to ask him whether his advocacy of corporal punishment is in response to a pressing social problem like that of the urban American schools, or whether he favors it simply as a matter of course.
No, it's not at all an advocacy in answer to a social problem like that, which I understand the problem of the American schools to be. In fact, I think it'd be a pretty poor solution for the problems you have to face there. I'm quite sure that corporal punishment is something which can only go on as part of a continuing tradition. You couldn't bring it in suddenly. I think it would probably be catastrophic to bring it into the American scene, as I understand the American scene, though my friend there, who is an American, will probably have something to correct. He usually corrects me on American history.
Is he permitted to correct you?
Yes. Oh, very ready to correct me, yes. No. All I would say about it is that in a school like mine, where it has been time out of mind since the memory of man runneth not to the contrary in use. The school dates from 1594, when the first settlements were tentatively being made on the eastern seaboard of the North American continent. I don't see any reason to do away with it. I don't think that my people particularly wish me to do away with it, meaning by those both the boys attending the school, the past boys, old boys as we quaintly say in England, And their parents, it's made clear to their parents that it is used before they send their children. And without thinking that it's a remedy for every evil, and a great many remedies for which it is not, evils for which it is not a remedy, I think it has a part to play, that it does satisfy some situations and solve some problems. But
why do you say that if it is a problem solver, it can't be introduced? Presumably before 1590, somebody thought to introduce it, and I take it that you historically approve that decision.
Well, I would say, may I embark on a very brief historical disquisition? I would say that the whole thing arises from history. There was a time when it was taken for granted that all boys were flogged in all nations everywhere. And in my view, for some extraordinary reason, which I'd be very grateful if any historian better informed than myself could tell me, there has never been an aristocracy in England in the sense that there has been on the continent of Europe. That is to say that in France, in Germany, in Sweden, in Spain, in Sweden, that notable modern social democracy still has a very arrogant and self-contained aristocracy. In Holland, few people realize there is an aristocracy, and there have been very powerful aristocracies. One of their privileges was, of course, to be set above the common man, and they could not be struck. Now, everybody who was the son of a nobleman was a nobleman under the Ancien Regime in France, in Germany, and enjoyed that privilege. In England, of course, there's never been anything except the peerage. You were either a member of the House of Lords or you weren't. If you weren't a member of the House of Lords, which was often quite small in numbers, under Queen Elizabeth about 85 in a nation of 4 millions, everybody else was a commoner. And there arose the practice also in England, I don't know why not on the continent, of sending your sons away to school, especially the sons of well-to-do people and the nobility and gentry. And there, as it was the custom to flog boys, the sons of the well-to-do and the noble-born got flogged. Incidentally, it's amusing to notice that the two juvenile kings of England, Henry VI in the 15th century and Edward VI in the 16th century, lest their tutors should be involved in charges of lèse-majesté, in laying hands upon them, both executed implements with their own hands, authorizing their tutors to chastise them as occasion may demand. So necessary was it to chastise all boys in those days. Following up my argument then, when, with the French Revolution, you get a break with the ordinary man demands the liberties of the nobility on the continent, one of the liberties he demands is freedom from corporal chastisement. But in England, it had never been a part of, regarded as an important part of liberty. Every Englishman was free. There was uniquely no use of judicial torture. I'm not saying that torture was not used by the royal prerogative, in the case of Guy Fawkes, a good example, but then it was used contrary to the Constitution and the law as it is used in the Soviet Union today. And it was, you find, in fact, William Harrison in 1577 writing that Englishmen are of such a stubborn nature that they will not endure torture, whereas in France, torture was commonly used to extract confessions up until the Revolution, up until 1787, to be precise.
Well, how do you say that they won't endure torture when manifestly they do, and I take it have and certainly do?
Well, the point I'm making, you see, is that flogging boys wasn't regarded as torture. But
why not? But this is surely an insensibility on the part of the British, rather than a clinical examination, isn't it?
The British are a very modern phenomenon. There's no such thing until 1603 or even 1707. There's the English. The English, well, all people thought, French and Germans, but I made my point rather badly. It was a privilege and an ability not to be struck. It's never been a privilege of an English gentleman not to be struck. Therefore, as education filtered down from the nobility and gentry to the middle and poorer classes, that tradition, that privilege never went with it. Everybody got struck alike.
Well, now, Mr. Newell, do you see that extremely interesting, by the way, historical background makes more understandable the the prevalence of that practice in England?
I think it may well make it more understandable. I wouldn't quarrel with the historical argument at all, but I don't think it acts in any sense as a justification of it. And I think to follow it through, it's interesting to see that now in the whole continent of Europe, we are almost alone in continuing to beat school children.
Well,
pretty
I was
well
trying to
every
explain why.
Yes, well, pretty well every other country has got rid of it. But I think it, in a sense, I feel it's more useful now to talk about the present situation in this country.
Well, one thing that is not clear to me is that whatever the tradition, whatever the provenance of the practice, it either is or is not useful for certain purposes. Do I understand that it is only useful for certain purposes if the culture is hospitable to the use of it, and that is why you say it would be disastrous to introduce it, for instance, in America? Yeah. Why would it be disastrous to introduce it?
Well, I should say many people went to America. I'm open to correction. Many people went to America to flee tyranny in Europe. And one of the, I mean, you've got to remember that the Russians were serfs until 1861, subject to the knout. Many Central Europeans fled to avoid a very real persecution, of which the whip and the rod were the real instruments. And I think that they carried with them that sense to the United States, and there's also the general ebullient sense of breaking free from past tradition that the United States had originally. And all this, excellent in its way and giving a great deal to the world, isn't the way that England has developed. And I don't think you could coerce people. You see, I think essentially, if you, I put it in this paradoxical way, which may seem very strange to an American audience, if, as you said, there are certain people in America who are saying that problems of schools demand corporal punishment, they must remember that corporal punishment requires two participants, one to give and one to take. And if the taker won't take, there's nothing you can do about it.
I don't quite follow you.
Well, I mean, if I want to beat a boy...
Presumably there are no willing takers.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Oh, you're kidding.
There's one.
Am I kidding?
Well, submissive, but not willing.
I think this is one of the points of the
people who are
practice.
executed in Sing Sing are, quotes, willing in the sense that they don't make a physical fight to avoid it, right?
But I do think this is one of the basic points about the practice, that it is a self-perpetuating thing, that you will find people in schools like Mr. Kuper's, boys, who are very willing to defend the use of corporal punishment and actually say it does them good. And you hear the same thing when the matter's discussed, for instance, in the House of Lords. Their lordships will get up and say it did them no harm anyway. Some of them will say it did them good. And of course one hears often the talk about how the cycle of education is not broken. Teachers tend to be in school, they go to teacher training college, colleges of education, they go back into school. Very often they're in authoritarian schools. They never get outside this cycle. They have very little experience of a world in which these sort of practices are now unthought of. I mean, outside schools, they are not thought of.
Hang on a sec, we'll be with you in just a few minutes. Well, if you're making the psychological point that people are used to what people are used to, then the answer is, I quite understand. But if you're making the further point that it becomes impossible to be objective on the point, merely because it is a part of your tradition, then I invite you to be objective anyway. After all, here you are disagreeing with Mr. Kuper, even though you're part of the same tradition.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Kuper seems to be saying, as I understand him, that granted the tradition is more or less unique to England, there is, however, no reason to repudiate that tradition. Is that correct, Mr. Kuper?
I think so. It's unique to England, and the same as practically unique to England is the tradition of an unarmed police. When I go to Spain, France, Italy, I am disgusted by the spectacle of policemen, and when I see films of the United States of policemen carrying guns, it rouses something inside me that makes me very angry.
Mm-hmm. Which, however, doesn't mean that you would counsel them against the use of
Well, yes. Well, no, I wouldn't counsel the Americans, no. And I wouldn't counsel the Spaniards. I would counsel the French, I think. And may I mention another thing that I think might express, it's interesting to explore these differences of national psychology. I've seen recently, not very recently, but I think recently enough for you probably to be able to tell me whether they're truly authentic, views of the inside of Annapolis and of the American Military Academy, West Point. There's a practice called hazing that goes on there. Standing a chap at attention and shouting in his face and abusing him and so on and so forth. Well, now, I've served in the British Armed Forces. I can just tell you that if anybody did that to me, I should clout him to 6, good and proper. One does not put up with that kind of behaviour as an English gentleman.
But well, what do you call your fagging system? That lasted several hundred years, didn't it?
Yes. Well, you didn't shout at your fag.
Well, what was to keep you from doing so?
The fact that your fag would, generally, I mean, you're people of equal social rank and you don't behave like that.
I think Mr. Kuper made a very real point when he said that it can only exist, corporal punishment, in a position in which both the giver and the taker accept it. And in fact, it's certainly true now that in a number of English schools, one is getting a situation in which the takers are not being prepared to take it and are walking out of the situation and are saying, I will not accept corporal punishment.
Well, using a metaphor, I mean, walking out in what sense? If one is summoned to punishment and one does not approve of the institution, is there a practical recourse in an English school?
The only practical recourse is clearly to remove oneself from the institution.
But at age 14 or 15, you don't have that authority, do you? It's a parental...
Well, it's clearly a parental thing, but there again, parents' opinions on this is certainly changing, and it's more likely to change through their children's experience and their children talking to them than any other way. And when one had this spectacle last May of still a small minority of London school children on the streets, just as they were at the end of the last century, aiming, amongst other things, to ban the cane, to remove petty restrictions on what they wear in school and how long their hair is and so on.
Did that significantly affect public sentiment?
I think it probably polarized it to a great degree. But I think
on the hawks got hawkier and the doves got
but on the other hand, it certainly has led to the development of the first signs of an organized militancy amongst school pupils, something which you've had in the States for some time now, I think. And there are now 2 organizations of pupils who I think there are obvious problems in organizations of pupils because pupils don't stay pupils very long. And for a lot of their school days, they're not articulate or feeling particularly militant about things. But that is changing.
Well, would it be feasible to have sort of a conscientious objection so that individual students who disapprove of the institution would be perpetually spared? Well,
this is obviously one suggestion. The other thing is that, which I think is bound to happen quite soon, is that I've got to go into the legal position in this country a bit to say this. I mean, teachers get their right to beat children from their role in loco parentis, in the place of parents. And that gives them the right to, the law says, reasonably chastise children. And the definition of reasonably depends very much on how the courts feel at a particular time. But it's at least debatable whether parents can challenge the delegation of certain parts of their authority to teachers. And whether if parents in fact told the school that they did not wish their child under any circumstances to be beaten, whether the teacher could lawfully still beat the child. And
this is break in there to say that is a portion of Mr. Newell's book with which I do agree wholeheartedly. I don't think that, you see, can I break in to say that I think you and I probably agree on one thing, at least I think we do, feeling our way. I am very opposed to, well, I will not call it compulsory education because I regard that as a contradiction in terms. I am very opposed to compulsory school attendance. And particularly to compulsory school attendance, which I regard as disreputable in its historical origins. It was created in Prussia in order to create a military cannon fodder and industrial proletariat sufficiently on the continent, sufficiently, and in this country, educated to be useful in the factories. Well, I won't go into that too much, but I'm against compulsory school attendance. I would not have anybody made to go to school if he didn't want to.
No matter at what age?
No matter at what age. No.
You wouldn't require literacy?
No, no. And people will pick up
would you extend the vote?
They want it.
Would you extend the vote to illiterates or?
Well, one does already. I mean, there are quite a lot of illiterates in this country, in spite of. I mean, you'd agree with me on that, wouldn't you?
Yes,
is there a formal requirement of literacy?
No, none whatever.
No, no.
There isn't.
You can even, I mean, all you do is make a square, an X, when you don't have to write your name.
Yes, I think
so you agree on this point?
Well, I think there's a danger of agreeing too early on, but in such a enormous sort of breadth,
Yeah.
because I think the compulsory school argument is a very broad one, and there would need to be a lot of safeguards, clearly.
Yeah, I agree.
In the present
Okay, but
situation.
let's pursue your line of questioning.
Yeah.
You are asking whether it is feasible to administer a school if there is a minority of students whose parents decline to extend the authority to the teachers to administer punishment. And I take it you're pressing for a legal concession on this point?
Well, I think it would be an interesting thing to have a test case on. I don't think that the law in this country, the legal system, is the place to look for the establishment of progressive policies. One doesn't have a constitution here to appeal to, which makes the situation very different from the States.
Although you would be sympathetic to the American ACLU position that it is a denial of due process?
Yes, indeed. I think that if we had a constitution, this would clearly be the...
in English law. It is part of the due process of English law.
Yes, but the legal situation is just different in the States.
Yes.
So I would agree with their position there.
Well, would you say it would be feasible, Mr. Kuper, in your school to have this this division among students that
No,
you could
well, I have in fact
punish?
secretly got a list of people who I have contracted out because of my own opinion of their personalities and characters and so on and so forth, or because their parents, in very few cases, very few, I think 3, have asked. Yes, there is a white list, you might call it, of people who are not subject, quite unknown to those there who belong to him.
And this is something that you simply choose to honor? But it is not an advertised arrangement?
Oh, no, no.
Or an advertised privilege? Well, it will be after today, I guess.
Well...
The point at which it becomes, in any sense, an instrument of change is clearly when it does become public and when parents and pupils feel sufficiently strongly about what goes on in schools to wish to make their influence felt and not to merely delegate all their feelings about education to professionals. I think it's interesting to look at the position on corporal punishment of the teacher unions in this country. They vary in their support of it, and the largest and in comparative terms, the most progressive of them, the National Union of Teachers. It supports not corporal punishment as such. It's very careful about this. It puts up a sort of smokescreen defense for it. It, in fact, supports the professional right of teachers to decide whether or not to beat children, rather than the right to beat children quite straightforwardly. And I think that is a precise example of the dangerous side of the professional concept. It is suggesting that there is this particular sort of people who've had a particular short training in an institution who are now able to make decisions about people's children, whether the people like it or not. I think this is a very dangerous concept of professionalism indeed.
I understand.
But one thing you did say in your introduction, which I'd just like to correct, was that all the educational associations in this country were supporting it. In fact, the teachers' associations are, but almost universally the parent-teacher associations, the Confederation for the Advancement of State Education, the various associations of psychologists, educational psychologists and so on, are pretty well universally opposed to the practice.
Then why don't their views prevail?
Well, the teachers are
minority views.
The teachers, they're minority in terms of numbers, certainly.
Oh, I see.
The teachers' associations are clearly the largest and, in that sense, the most powerful force in education. And also, politically, it's not a popular subject.
You were going to say, Mr. Cooper?
Well, I just wanted to slip in there that the schoolmaster in Mr. Newell's view can't be right, because either he's only had a very short training in a teacher's training college and so on, and very new to the job, or else he's like me and been at it for 40 years, is sunk in sin and impervious to any new ideas and practices. I mean, whichever we are, we're wrong, aren't we?
Well, if you believe in corporal punishment, you're wrong, in my view.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's rather like a phrase.
He makes a good methodological point that you either are so inexperienced that your views are invalid, or you're so experienced that they're custom-crusted.
Well, yes, one can find plenty of people in both positions who take my point of view now. I mean, a growing number, particularly in the younger side of the profession.
Well, you know, I haven't heard you really defend the practice, Mr. Cooper. You've given us a lot of interesting history.
Defend it? Well, I mean, how does one defend punishment at all? It stops people from misbehaving, one hopes. It doesn't stop them absolutely.
As a deterrent, then?
Yes, it's a deterrent, yes.
Well, but it's a deterrent that is only effective in a cultural context.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
But here again, I mean, the one regulation that affects all schools, all maintained state schools in this country, is that they have to keep a punishment book in which are recorded, this is the official line, all instances of corporal punishment. In fact, an awful lot go unrecorded, but that's the rule. If you look at any punishment book, you find the same names occurring over and over again.
So no, there's recidivism.
This idea that it's a deterrent is quite obviously disproved by looking at any punishment book in any secondary
No,
school.
but it may not deter the offenders, but it may deter other people from offending. Wouldn't that be Ms. Cooper's point?
That would be
Yes,
one of
I
my
think.
points. But secondly, the fact that these people occur over and over again, how often do they occur over and over again? I mean, they don't occur in my punishment book over and over again. It's very rare for somebody to occur more than 3 or 4 times in his 5 years. And Do
you concede this?
Well, it depends obviously on the school. I wouldn't quarrel with what Mr. Cooper says about his own school, but there are certainly other
Is
schools.
his experience characteristic?
No.
It's certainly not, no. I
No,
think he'd agree with
my
you.
experience is not characteristic because my school is a very odd one. It's a school in which the oh dear, it's very awkward for an American audience. It's a school which charges no fees, that's the first thing, but which is selective and therefore has, believe it or not, looking at those two, people who are above the average intelligence for the nation as a whole, that which doesn't mean they're easier to manage, by the way. More intelligent people are not necessarily easier to manage. They can be more ingenious in misdoing. Also, they can be maladjusted just as easily and unhappy and home and so on just as easily as less intelligent people. But it has a continuing tradition in a way that many newly created schools wouldn't have. It's got the elements of what we in England would call a public. I know you will immediately say a private school. It has the quality and elements of life of an English public school. I myself,
Are you an employee of the state?
No, no. I'm an employee of a private corporation called the United Westminster Schools.
Right.
Although most of the money, well, in fact, no schoolmaster, oddly enough, there's the Confederation for the Advancement of State Education, but there is no state education in Great Britain. It is purely done by local authorities, county and borough authorities. This school has a body of tradition carried down. It has a strong, again, odd English phrase, old boy connection. One of the things you have to remember is that if I'm going to beat a boy at the age of 15, within 10 years' time, or 6 or 7 years' time, I'm going to be possibly round a bar with him up at Oxford with the other undergraduates at Oxford from the school, and he's going to be telling me what he thinks about my disciplinary methods late in the evening after he's had several beers.
Or even before?
Or even before. I mean, we continue to live together.
Yeah.
It's I think, a terrible mistake to make the corporal punishment a sort of frightful thing that happens, and there is a gulf between the two people ever after. We live together and chat together. And
Can I just suggest that what I really find abhorrent about it is that it is really the symbol of an authoritarian school system. I think that is the basis of it. The actual practice itself.
Would this extend any punishment?
Any punishment.
Yeah. Would it extend equally to any punishment?
This is, I think, becoming ready.
Well, here again, we
Keeping
have to
people
talk,
in after school hours or something like that?
Well, here we have to make a differentiation between the present situation and moving from there to an ideal situation. In the present situation, clearly, the way schools are organised, the sort of pressures they have to meet certain employment situations in society, that whole analysis of the education system certainly implies some forms of restraint on pupils, just like the compulsory attendance that you mentioned. If one moved to a different situation in which there was no compulsory attendance, in which schools were performing a genuinely educational function as whatever, community education centres or whatever, then I would certainly hope that punishment would play no part in them whatsoever. But at the moment...
That would make schools unique, wouldn't it? It would make them different from the state. So long as the state uses punishment, what is disreputable about punishment?
Well, you're not against all punishment, or are you?
I'm not against all punishment, no. Clearly people have to be restrained from doing violence to other people.
What would be the kind of
property.
punishment that you would consider perfectly acceptable?
I think removal from the premises
so do I,
or
but
the
I can't do
institution
that, or...
is the most straightforward and obvious one.
Well, that's pretty apocalyptic, isn't it? I mean canning people. That's the word we use.
Yes.
Well,
What do
to
you call it?
remove
Sending them
to
down, or
suspend
whatever you call it, yeah.
Yes, well, obviously you need to have an immense system of appeals and everything to make it a fair system. But I still think that at the moment that is the most fair expedient. If you have a community in which some people
But
are...
isn't that rather heavy, that punishment for minor infractions?
Well, I'm not suggesting it's a lifetime sentence. I'm suggesting that
suspension
it
of some
might be
sort.
a straightforward, quick suspension for a very short period. But obviously, if you're moving towards an ideal institution, that sort of thing plays no part at all.
No, but you got to have a greater objection to corporal punishment than merely that it is a symbol of authoritarianism.
Yes, well,
Because,
yes, of course, I have many objections. And another one is that it passes on a simple message that violence is, in some sense, an answer to problems.
Okay,
But
how about
violence
that?
is an answer to problems. All power, as
indeed.
Mao Zedong said, comes out of the muzzle of a gun.
Yeah, that doesn't make it right.
Well, it makes it right if Mao Zedong has the gun, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
but Stalin also pointed out that the Pope has no divisions, but he does have power.
I think you talked about the situation in some inner city schools in the States now, and while things have not anything like reached that state in this country yet, there are signs that things are getting worse and people are very worried about it. And one of the surprising things I still think is that they believe that introducing more repressive regimes, more things like corporal punishment, is going to, in some sense, cure the situation.
Well, Mr. Cooper thinks it will.
Because if you look at
He
the...
says it's a deterrent. You said it
No,
wasn't
but if you...
It's
can I
a
just-
deterrent for my sort of boy in my sort of school.
But if you look at the experience of those small minority of heads of schools who are not working on that basis, who are beginning to free their schools and make them more like real-life institutions, real life outside these four walls, you find that removing corporal punishment is merely the first step in a long period of reform, and that far from making things worse or making discipline more difficult, it immediately makes relationships in the school that bit better, that bit easier, because you can't really like someone who on occasions gets out his cane and hits you.
Is that true?
It's just not possible.
Is that true?
Well, if you can, it's a fairly perverted form of life.
Well, but that's, well, what about,
A
what
number
about
of my
parents
pupils seem
who
to
do
like
that?
me quite well and even send me Christmas
Parents.
cards sometime after they've left, but this will be said to be sycophancy or masochism or something of the kind.
Parents, I think, you mentioned parents.
Yeah.
I think parents have, on the whole, a very much closer and more loving relationship with children, on the whole, than school teachers do.
You mean your
And
point is that
within
there's no
the
such thing as
context
a
of that-
benevolent headmaster who, if in fact he occasionally beats his students, but English literature is full of, Dr. Arnold was certainly beloved, wasn't he?
Well, he's certainly beloved in history. Whether he was totally beloved
No, I
at
mean
the
beloved
time,
by his students, wasn't he?
I'm very suspicious of that analysis of...
You
Oh,
saw
I
this.
would have thought the evidence of his Cambridge protégés, of those that went on to Cambridge, was overwhelming, that he was a tremendous force in their lives, and they did love and revere him.
Well, the ones who survived and got through to Cambridge probably did indeed love...
What happened to those who didn't survive?
Well, quite.
Well,
And
of
if,
course,
you know, again,
those...
I was asking you a historical question.
Yes, we have no record.
we have
I'm
no
afraid,
record, you see. I mean, this is so often the case. I mean, it's worth putting in perspective the sort of school that Mr. Kuper works in. And in this country, just under half the children leave at the earliest possible moment. They leave school at 15.
But not because they've been beaten, surely.
I'm not suggesting one particular reason for it. I'm just putting the thing in its context. And only 6% go on to university, which is a very small number indeed.
Yeah. Kenton Sparks is an American and a student of Mr. Cooper, and I think you're very anxious to say something, or...
Well, the author of this book made a comment that...
Mr. Newell is his
Mr.
name.
Newell, sorry, that when you put into a grammar school society, it's a very closed society, and that you don't know anything about the outside world and other situations. I've been to a school in Germany, I've been to schools in Holland, I've been to schools in America, and I've been to schools in England. And I think the essential thing to realize about a grammar school, which is the school that I am in, is that you're basically there to work. And if you go to a school and you're there to work, then you're not really affected by the punishments there, because that's a minor thing. You're there to work, and you're thankful that you're in a situation where you're kind of creamed off the top of the milk and put into a special situation where you can work and get through to university. To get to university in England is a great privilege. As Mr. Newell said, there's only 6% that get through. You've got to work to get through to university. You've got to come through academically high, and it doesn't bother me that I may get caned in the process. But if you say that...
Well, does it bother you that it bothers other boys?
Well, I think that the type of boys that it bothers are mainly those type of boys who are at school because they have to be at school, or they're at school because they haven't got anything else to do. School is just something that they hate.
You mean you can't visualize it's bothering a boy who is nevertheless glad to be in school and is a very industrious worker?
Well, I can't see a boy being worried about the fact that, or being really upset and causing complete chaos in his life because of the fact he's been beaten, if he's really there
No, but you've told us that you don't mind. I'm asking you whether you are concerned that other people do mind, or are you?
Well, I am concerned that other people do mind, but I don't think that you'll find many of them, as Mr. Kuper said, in a grammar school situation.
That's what I was going to ask. Do you mean within the school that they mind?
Yeah.
Because this is one of the things that I very often try and explore, and it's so easy to get the answer that you want to find, as I'm very well aware. But I do ask these chaps time and again, especially when they're leaving, about 18, and they're perfectly free to say what they like to me. And I say, well, come on now, jot down, give me 3 quick ideas for improving the place. What would you do? They say better food quite often. There's certainly other. Practically never does a question of corporal punishment come up.
Do you agree with that?
Well, this is why I was trying to put the situation
do you think
in
they're all
perspective,
brainwashed?
Because I think that the small minority who go to grammar school and go on to university and tend to get into the leading positions in society, you know, still a disproportionate number, in fact, come from what we call our public schools, your private schools. I think this explains, again, why the practice is still so popularly defended in high quarters. Because it is this sort of rarefied experience, a very academic experience, that those sort of people go through who become MPs or lords or bishops or whatever.
A form of hazing.
Well, you
Yes,
needn't say they become lords or MPs or bishops. A lot of them become doctors and lawyers and businessmen.
Yes,
So on.
they have the same opinions.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. But I
Whereas-
mean, they've got to learn a lot in a short time, and therefore a troublemaker among them has got to be suppressed fairly promptly if he's going to disrupt the class and so on.
Well,
And
this
most
again,
believe in that
yes.
being done.
This again teaches that, you know, that conformity is the way to win through, really. And this again is where I suggest that the basic argument is about the aims of the education system. I have heard Mr. Cooper on previous occasions say that he sees one of his first aims to produce people like him in his school.
Well, I said in the last analysis, I said that all people teaching in schools, when they are really driven with their backs to the wall and asked, what sort of person do you want to produce, say, I want to produce a person like myself. That's about all that we can conceive, really. I mean, any of us sitting around.
I think that's a very dangerous analysis.
If you are teaching in a school, you don't want to produce a person like me.
But have you never isolated your shortcomings
Yes, frequently.
and attempted to guide your students
But I'm saying
around
in the
them?
last analysis, we are rarely, all schoolmasters rarely say to pupils, be like me. They say it by example and by... The only thing I do say is, don't be like me, I smoke cigarettes and you're not allowed.
But I think this view of the aims of education is quite incompatible with thinking that you want to produce people who are really in control of their own lives.
But you
and thinking
don't
for
want to produce
themselves.
people who are in control of their own lives. You want to produce people who are in a state of perpetual simmering rebellion. And there's a great difference
I think
between
the two could
things.
well be the same. If being in control of your life implies rebellion, then rebellion.
But
fine.
Mr. Newell, you don't object to conformity in such axiomatic matters as listening to the teacher, do you? You don't concede the right of a student to disrupt a classroom in such a way as to make it impossible for others to hear the teacher, do you?
No, of course not. But here again, this implies a particular sort of teaching situation, which increasingly is becoming outdated, I think. And the English primary school, which I think is talked about a lot in the States now, is moving towards a much less structured situation in which that sort of description of what happens would no longer apply, and in which the pupils are in a much more individual situation to the teacher, a much more individual relationship to the teacher.
But if you're going to bring the kind of methods that are used in the English primary school onwards into the secondary school, I'm bound to say it's going to take you a very great deal longer to produce your doctors and your dentists and your veterinary surgeons and your lawyers.
I don't think it could take much longer to produce a doctor than it does at the moment. It's, what is it?
Well, it takes about to about the age of 27 at the moment, doesn't
Yes,
it? And we start on the process at the age of 15 or 16.
I can't believe that that's a necessary period to...
Well, it's not for me
Do
to
anything.
examine the content. I don't claim to have the idea, the knowledge of my fingers' ends, but I don't know. I would say there was a very great deal to be learned. They learn in a very systematic way.
Well, let's hear from Timothy Hands, who is also a student at Mr. Cooper's school. Has something been said on this subject of corporal punishment that prompts you to ask a question or make a comment?
Well, I'd like to ask Mr. Newell. His alternative to corporal punishment, he said, was to send boys home for a limited period, or ultimately to send them on to another school. Is that right?
No, I think I'm very glad you asked that question, as they say. I think it's very important to avoid talking. I mean, I don't believe that removing corporal punishment immediately means that you need a whole range of new repressive measures in its place. If that was true, then abolition would have little point. The experience of schools which have abolished corporal punishment, and they're not just schools in cushy middle-class areas, they're schools in all sorts of areas, all over the country. Schools for the maladjusted, for educationally subnormal children, and inner city schools and so on. Their experience is, as I said earlier, that it makes things easier. It makes relationships much more straightforward and honest between teachers and pupils. It makes it possible quite simply for them to be friends. And that removes rather than increases the need for repressive measures.
But I think if you take away corporal punishment and you put in some other form of punishment, then in a few years' time the militants are going to be saying, well, we don't like this, and you'll change way. Don't you think perhaps you're giving way to them? No one likes punishment, that they don't like this punishment, therefore they're going to rebel against it.
If corporal punishment was merely replaced by another form of punishment, whatever sort, another form of repression, then that would probably happen, and quite right. But as I said, I think it's more likely that both teachers and pupils will learn a new form of relationship from the absence of this particular fairly vicious practice. And they'll learn a new way of getting to know each other, and that will stop this need.
Well, Mr. Newell, if we are to do this, we've got to have a radical alteration of the law in this country. At the moment, the law says you must go to the age of go to school to the age of 15 plus. In my view, a tremendous mistake. It is about to say you must go to the age of school to the age of 16 or 16 plus. I have said I would sweep the whole thing away completely. But you see, we have the great example, the great preacher to us all, and a good old man, and A.S. Newell, who ran Summerhill. But he runs Summerhill for very rich people on the basis that he can allow these children to do exactly as they please, and that eventually boredom will drive them into the classroom. That's a fair description, in his own words, isn't it, of how he does it. And it is for very rich people, because only very rich people can afford this kind of thing. It's a very roundabout way.
Why should it be so expensive? I think you'd have fewer teachers.
Yes, he has fewer teachers, he has large facilities in the country and so on. If I could do it like that, I'd love to do it like that, but I can't. I've got to do 900 boys in rather antiquated buildings, very crowded. Getting about the staircases looks rather like putting people under the Japanese underground. And in various circumstances that are far from ideal, and this creates tensions. There are also tensions from their home, which are translated into the school. Nevertheless, I've got to get a fairly high level of academic performance. And therefore, I've got to put down, by the most humane method I can, some people who disrupt the activities of others.
Well, beating is hardly the most humane method you can think of.
Some boys think it is.
No, how about you?
For some boys it can be. Only yesterday I was saying to a boy, look here, I don't think so. And he said, well, if you think you're going to keep me in, sir, with respect for 4 periods, I shan't come.
Ah, and was that an impasse?
That's an impasse. All I can do is beat him now.
And what would be done in France in a similar situation?
I don't know. I'd love to know.
You might write and find out.
I would, yes. The trouble is it's so difficult for a schoolmaster to go across to France and find out, because roughly the terms coincide. Don't know what would happen in France. I think they'd probably be beastly to them. One of the things one never does in an English school, or one never should do, in my view, is to employ sarcasm or any kind of personal verbal attack, which I think is far crueler. The tongue is far crueler than the rod.
You agree, Mr. Newell?
I wouldn't agree with that. I think they're both extremely cruel, and I don't think that either of them have any place in an educational process at all.
But then you are saying that all your educational process should be A.S. Newell's educational process, aren't you? And we're a very long way from it in this country at the moment, and public opinion is a very long way from it.
Well, I think that's to unnecessarily simplify what I'm saying. I don't think that one will move straight into a position in which the A.S. Neill free school idea is applied to all types of children in all types of school. I certainly think that his basic methodology is correct. And I think an awful lot of teachers would agree with it.
I've got a set timetable which these chaps are supposed to conform to. Now, one of them walks out and goes for a walk around the grounds and just doesn't feel like doing it. Well, the first time he does it, I'd probably say to him, look, you really can't do this. It's disrupting things and making things difficult. For goodness sake, pull yourself together and don't be silly. But if he goes on doing it, what do I do then? I've got to impose some sort of punishment.
Well, it's difficult to start this argument about a particular situation in Mr. Cooper's school because, well, just because I think that in a sense, the fixed timetable in itself is an imposition on people which cannot possibly,
well, there we're throwing away 9/10 of exhibited educational practice.
Well, can I just finish what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't think that you can fragment learning into short periods. I think that the experience of schools which have started in a very tentative way, for instance, to block timetable, to give people at least a whole morning or afternoon doing the same activity, this is at least a start in the right direction. You can't begin to meet the individual needs of children.
Yeah, that may very well be, Miss Newell, and I'm sympathetic, but it is sort of a cop-out as regards the question that Mr. Cooper put. If geography is going to be taught at 10 o'clock, and the geography teacher shows up at 10 o'clock, but meanwhile the students who began at 9 o'clock studying mathematics decline to make way for the geography teacher, a certain amount of chaos is going to result. Well, somebody has to administer the transition.
But you have to decide what you're going to accept as basic premises. One problem, I think, is the size of institutions, of school institutions at the moment. And I don't think the argument that they have to be big in order to offer a big variety of courses is a good one, partly because you can provide those sort of facilities centrally, in fact. And the other thing is that anyway, they are only there for a very small proportion of the age range. So.
Well, if you don't mind, let me abort that argument unless you relate it to corporal punishment, because otherwise we'll simply get into general pedagogical...
all I'm saying is that size is used to justify a number of practices, like rigid timetabling, which make discipline difficult, because students quite naturally rebel against them. And that very often is where measures like corporal punishment are brought in to push people back into conforming. That's all.
In England?
In England.
Victor O'Dwyer, you are here because you feel strongly on the subject, is that correct? And what is your position?
What do you mean?
Well, what is your position on corporal punishment, that it is ought to be abolished here in England?
Yeah, I think it should be chucked out because the kids get to hate the teachers and they don't work with them well and all this, you know?
That they would work better with the teachers if they didn't administer corporal punishment?
Yeah, they get to know them better and then they work with them better.
Is that your personal experience?
Yeah.
Well, have you resented the use of corporal punishment at your expense? Or do you agree with Mr. Cooper that it being part of the system, you don't particularly object to it?
Well, in some schools they might need corporal punishment.
Would Edwards, would you agree?
No, because it just, you hit the child, he does it again. It just happens more and more. And as you said, you get to hate the teachers and can't work with them.
So you think that you want to comment on that?
I think it depends very much on the individual. In the comprehensive system, which is used for a vast majority of people, I mean, the whole aim is just to teach you until you're 15, and then you're kind of thrown out into the system. They hardly cater for you in sixth form at all. Their aim is just to kind of get you through as far as the law is concerned, and it's a very impersonal society. Therefore, they make the laws very lax. So you come along to school, and if you don't feel like going to school, you can skive off, and maybe nothing will happen to you. Teachers are afraid to cane you because the natural reaction is, well, if they're going to beat me, then I'm going to rebel, and it just puts all sorts of people into a society at a very young age, at the age of 11, where they can do what they want. They're free to run their own lives, and then people often go astray. I mean, when I was in an American school, we were left very much to do what we wanted in break times. I mean, what we did was almost completely unknown to the teachers.
Not necessarily go astray. You learn one subject, you learn it.
But you've got all this free time, haven't you, when you're at school? You've got, I mean, you've got
Yeah,
free
you can put it
periods.
all into the one subject you want, so you learn your job.
But how many people are willing to do that at the age of 11? That's what I'm saying. I mean, Mr. Newell is saying, well, let these children choose their own timetable, let them do their own work, let them choose their own responsibilities. Well,
Victor,
people aged 11 can't choose their own responsibilities.
He's learning mechanics, and he's learned an awful lot about it since he's been at the free school.
Well, good for him.
Yes, you do your job,
but
you
what
learn your
you
job.
got to learn history for when you want to learn a job like this and all this?
Because I want to learn history, it's my favourite subject.
Victor, what are you going to think about inside your head when you're doing the duller parts of the mechanic's job? It's not meant to be a trick question or a clever one or anything like that. I mean, you've got to think about something. I mean, there are work one does with one's hands which is pretty dull. I mean, I've been a sailor for 6 years, and I know quite a bit about mechanics and so on. It's pretty dull. What are you going to think about? Do you read widely?
Yeah, you can, when you're doing this job, you can read about subjects.
So you do want more to your education than just vocational. You know what I mean by vocational education, just training on the bench kind of thing, don't you? You need more than training to use a lathe or to don't you?
Well, Victor, Mr. Cooper's asking, aren't you anxious to learn about history, even though you don't anticipate becoming a teacher of history, simply because to know something about history is to know something about your country, about your tradition. Makes it easier to talk to people, doesn't it?
You could do the history of motor cars.
And the what?
The history of motor cars.
Motor cars, yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Well,
That's a very short history.
it doesn't, yeah, I was going to say, it doesn't take you back that far. It's interesting
It's
enough.
not going to do anything about Edward
yeah.
VI or Henry VI.
Yeah.
But I think this illustrates that, in fact, it illustrates to some extent, anyway, that an awful lot of what is being taught in most schools is still very irrelevant to the present needs and interests of children. That doesn't mean that at some future point they may not be very interested in history and really want to learn about it, but their position at the moment and their background and where they live and so on makes it very unlikely that they're going to want to learn about things which are totally disconnected with them.
Well,
if it starts from where they are...
You have almost a champion in that there who devotes his time to classical Greek, which is, or much of his time to classical Greek, which
Mr.
is
Timothy?
one of the accepted, Timothy Hans, though, who's also incidentally a violinist.
Well, what do you there was a famous observation in the 18th century by Dr. Johnson having to do with the use of the rod in order to persuade people, precisely to stimulate their academic interests. This you reject utterly, I take it, you, Miss Newell. Now, do you reject that utterly, Mr. Cooper?
You mean there is less flogging in our great schools nowadays, but then there is less learnt there. And thus what is gained at the one end is lost at the other.
That's correct.
Yes.
not necessarily. Is it lost?
No, Dr. Johnson thought it was. He said in later life, my master whipped me well. Without that, I should have done nothing. But then Dr. Johnson was not universally right about everything. Gracious me, besides, he died 200 years ago.
So what?
Which almost proves he must be wrong. No, I don't think that. But what I think is that I don't want somebody stepping between me and the people that I run, I think, pretty happily now, and for whom I do occasionally use corporal punishment. I think not terribly often. Quite a lot of them think I use it wisely and reasonably.
You might have something stepping between you and the pupils, the cane, the punishment.
But it doesn't, you see. I mean, you've just got to make an effort of imagination.
But in most schools it does.
Well, I can't help that. I'm not responsible for most schools. I'm only responsible for my own school, and I don't think other people ought to step in and try to be responsible for my school in my place. I mean, in the words of some contemporary of Dr. Johnson's, I would say, in the words of the elder Pitt, being responsible, I will direct, and I will be responsible for nothing which I do not direct. And I do direct the place, and I'll answer for anything that happens in it, you see. If you came to it, you'd enjoy it. Oh, yes, you would.
I feel that an important part about education is cooperation between the teachers and the pupils, and I think it's very important for the pupils to approach the thing in the right mind. I mean, it's very easy to build yourself up and say, well, I don't like the teachers. Wherever the teacher says, well, I'm not interested, you know, that's it, I do what I want, fair enough. And it's a situation that can be developed in any way. But if you do something wrong, say at our school, there are very few things that you can be caned for first offence. And when you are caned, I mean, you're not thinking, oh, look, here's this repressive teacher trying to punish me because I've done something which I think is wrong. I'm sure that, I mean, Mr. Cooper wouldn't cane somebody who thought he was genuinely right in the issue, because that would just defeat the issue. Oh. But you can't generalise in this thing. Most people...
You might get caned for something that you thought wasn't wrong. And you wouldn't like it.
Well, in that case, I hope you'd tell me so first, and then we'd talk it over, and you know, idea, we might think of all kinds of different things, substitute punishments, or perhaps no punishment at all. You give me a pledge to do something or other. But I get a number of chaps who come to me and they say, yes, that's right, well, I did do so and so. I did skip out of the lesson when I know perfectly well the penalty for skipping out of the lesson is getting caned, so let's get on with it.
My games group one afternoon, and I got 2 on the backside just for missing it.
Yeah,
because they left earlier.
Well, missing playing games. Games are compulsory in most English schools.
Is that a routine punishment for missing games?
I should think a little...
Well, most of our time in our school.
A little high-handed, I would have thought.
You leave your towel at home for the shower after you get caned.
Well, I would have thought that was a little high-handed. Could I explain, if it's not being too tedious and lengthy,
sure.
Time allows? We've got a system here, I've filled in my own name on it. That's a conduct card. And you carry one of these around with you, which is rather convenient. It gives you your own timetable, where this wicked thing where you've got to go from day to day.
And you get your mark off your teacher, what I think you've
That's
done.
right,
That's
yeah, it gives you your preparation timetable there, you see, show you what you... And inside here, when you annoy someone, he writes his name in there, and you've got 7 days to find some useful task to do in the school from somebody who can give you a useful task, who will sign this thing off.
It's sort of a remission.
That's right. You know, you've done something rather tiresome, so you try and do something useful, like picking up paper around the grounds, or...
Thank God I don't have to carry one of those
101 things like that. When you get to number 5 here, there's a little star, that rather conveniently brings you in to discuss the situation with the headmaster, you see. And he says, why have you got 5? It's a bit early in the time to get 5 conduct marks. So watch your step from now.
This is cumulative.
Yeah, yes. Go on. When you've filled up to 5 there.
Yeah. I mean, you don't get a fresh one every week or anything.
No, no.
But in our school, you get a conduct card. They sign it in. If it's something bad, you get sent to the headmaster and he'd cane you, just because you've done one thing wrong.
Well, I don't. I just ask you to think why you've got 5 conduct marks.
And then what happens?
Well, then the chap and I discussed why he's got 5 conduct marks, and I put my initials on there to say that I have discussed it with him. And then we get on to another run of another 3, and we get 8, you see. By this time it's getting well on in the term, and I say to him, well, you know, really, because any system like this, these very petty punishments, eventually you get someone who runs straight through out the other end when he's got 10. Now there he runs the risk, I don't say he will be, he runs the risk of getting caned. And in fact, I caned 2 boys of about 13 last week who had used up their whole 10 conduct marks well inside the first half of the term. They came along to give one another mutual confidence and duly thought that this was a very reasonable procedure, said thank you very much, and resolved that they would behave better in future, and that the transaction was one of bought and paid for, and there needn't be any hard feelings.
Mr. Newell's point is that they won't behave better in the future, right?
Well, that's true, and also the conduct situation is based on Mr. Cooper's own arbitrary, in my view of what constitutes good conduct, and about a series of regulations which many might regard...
Well, it must be based on somebody's view.
It could be based on more people than just yours within your institution.
Well, is his idiosyncratic?
Sorry?
Is his idiosyncratic?
Well, I don't know what it's based on. In his mind, it's presumably it's based on his justification that he's trying to produce people like him. But I don't think that's a good view of education.
That does stick terribly in your throat. This thing that I said of producing people like oneself is that I think in the last analysis you want to produce people like yourself.
No.
I'm quite sure you do. No. You show every mark of it, if I may say so without
I want them to be able to think for themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Newell. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And thank you, gentlemen of the panel, ladies and gentlemen.
For For a printed copy of this program, send 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29205. That address again, Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29205. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.